I love conventions because it's nice to find a place where you fit in that appeals to you, that caters to things that you enjoy, and where you're not looked at as an outsider and you have to explain the things that you like to do.
If I'm being totally honest, I think that as a rule, sometimes nerd culture can be just a little socially not all with it. And I think that it's not a culture that gets together in large gatherings as often as it has been in recent years.
So, in a recent magazine article in Bitch Magazine, 25% of women at Comic-Con and pop culture conventions report being sexually harassed. And 13% of people report having unwanted comments. 8 of all genders report that have been groped, assaulted, or raped at a comic convention.
And I learned the hard way that you shouldn't be an underage girl wearing just a strip of cloth. It's just a bad idea.
We all use harassment in the sense of like a really severe form of bullying. Not to say that bullying itself doesn't have severe consequences and can't be just as bad, but there's a kind of legal definition of harassment. For example, here in New York, and I think in most places you kind of need either a physical altercation or the threat of an imminent physical altercation in order to have anything more than like a misdemeanor.
It doesn't have to be a credible threat to actively deter someone from a field. If you've got the equivalent of a kid poking you on the arm going, hey, 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 every 5 seconds all day, you're still not going to get work done. And addressing that kind of derailing harassment as well is, I think, really important.
We use the term a little bit more loosely just because obviously if something happens at a convention and it's serious, you need that kind of term to define it, and you need to be able to inform other people of what happened. And so you kind of need that severity of the word, even though it may not be the legal definition of the word as we know it.
Do you think the escapism and fantasy of geek culture leads to harassment behavior?
I have heard of instances where that is the case.
I think a lot of people see conventions as kind of existing outside of their normal rules of society and social interaction, and they do to an extent. But they go in and it's not an environment they're necessarily familiar with, and it's not an environment they necessarily have a set schema of appropriate behavior for. And so again, they sometimes end up taking things further than they would otherwise.
When I was doing Sally Jupiter, if you know Watchmen, she is sexually assaulted in the comics. And so when I was her, I had people dressed as the character who sexually assaulted her in the comics, trying to do similar or inappropriate things to me or with me that obviously I didn't want or allow or anything like that.
But I think most fans, at least in my experience, know the distinction well enough to keep the character separate from the person. At least I would hope so.
I don't think it's as direct as if we portray women better in comics, harassment will be fixed in comics, because it's pervasive. I mean, you don't have to be reading comics to be steeped in that.
I'm a woman, so I can only give the woman's perspective on such a thing. I don't claim to speak for men and what they might see, but I do know that no matter what a woman is wearing, a woman's body is her own, and just because she's wearing a certain thing that might be construed as being provocative, it does not give you the right to demean her or take advantage of apparel. It's just apparel. It doesn't change the right of the person to be respected.
I feel women want to be comfortable and have the right to dress any way they like, and still feel confident, still feel that they deserve respect. I feel like, they have every right to dress as they feel fit, as they feel comfortable.
I think that really nerd culture needs to change, and that we have to accept the fact that, wow, crazy, women are people, and also cosplayers are people, and therefore deserve respect just like anyone else, and should be treated with the same respect that you would give a normal person walking down the street. And unfortunately for some people that means yelling, hey, sweet tits at someone, but for most of us it means, just leaving them alone, and I think that would be preferable.
There's also a degree of, I think, and I'm talking specifically about fans in this context, and I want to make it really clear that harassment at conventions isn't limited to fans and isn't limited to convention attendees. But to meeting people whose work they're familiar with, or who are dressed as characters they're familiar with, who come in with a certain degree of understanding and familiarity, and don't really consider that it might not be reciprocal. That you follow, Brian Bendis's Twitter, and you've read all of his work, and you feel like you really know him, but you're still kind of a stranger going the other way. And I think people don't necessarily realize that stuff isn't reflective, or don't really consider that a lot of the time.
There's been a sea change in the last 3 to 5 years of that some of these behaviors are just not acceptable in con space anymore. So that the change from the old boys club with First Fandom, with some of the things that we saw certain venerated giants of the industry in science fiction and comic fandom get away with in the past, both very overtly and covertly. So one of the things that we can do now is a lot of these cons, almost all of them have to have some sort of consent harassment policy, and that's a huge positive change.
So ReedPop contacted the Mary Sue, which had been actively critical of the lack of a clear policy, and asked them if they'd put together a team to develop it.
They approached us and asked us if we would be interested in participating in that, and we were tremendously excited. We were tremendously excited both that they wanted to do it and do it on a large scale and really get it integrated into all aspects of the con, and we were super excited that they approached us because we knew a lot of people, sort of through the internet and on Twitter, who talked openly about hey, I have expertise in this.
What the Mary Sue did was ask their readers and talk to one another and assemble a team of folks who'd been active in convention policy and work and criticism.
And so it was absolutely something that we were super excited to do, is to get a group of people together from all around the internet to collaborate.
I have mixed feelings about this, actually, because while I really appreciate that ReedPop's doing this and wanted to go to people who are authorities, what they ended up doing in some ways kind of boils down to taking advantage of goodwill, because they went to a lot of professionals and consultants and basically said, we have 3 days to get this in the program, will you put this together for free? And that kind of put all of us in a position where it's more important to us to have it there than to get paid for it, but it's a little frustrating when it's a convention this size with a corporation this big, which is a trend I'm concerned with.
They had a selection so that people could nominate for it, and somebody put my name in, and I don't know who. And I got an email from Jill Pantozzi, who is their editor-in-chief. And then it was kind of a really quickly put together. I got the email, and 3 days later we had a roundtable Skype discussion with a number of other people who work in comics and also who deal with social issues. And we worked with a sort of bare bones structure that ReedPop had given us and just kind of built on it, gave them suggestions.
We did a lot of research. We looked at a lot of other existing policies, crunched through what they had, crunched through what we thought were necessary additions and ways to make it navigable, and then sent them a list of suggestions which they pretty much directly used.
And it's a huge step on ReedPop's part that they did this policy, because there was a real I don't know if you were here last year when Arizona Tea was a sponsor. They were giving out things that said, I love big cans on them. A lot has been done, at least in New York, and it seems like San Diego as well, to kind of get rid of a lot of the more sexist advertising that encourages a culture of harassment.
And ReedPop was pretty good about putting together as much as they could in short notice, and in the future they're going to do a lot more with their shows. as far as harassment policy stuff goes. But it's been really cool to see the signs everywhere, especially like they got Amy Reeder, who draws for Rocket Girl and used to work on Batwoman, and got her to do this really cool cosplay is not consent sign, and it looks fantastic. Every time I see one, it just makes me so happy.
It's been very impressive this year looking around and seeing all the signage and everything posted up, cosplay is not consent, and all of the, in all the panels everywhere. That's a huge part of it. If you don't have these things visible where people can see them, it's an accountability thing. It's actually a very sort of literally corporate thing. You have to have the ability to say, we showed you this wasn't acceptable, you did it anyway. There is no argument because it was here, because you saw it. And so it's actually really great to see it up around here. And if that continues to happen in other spaces, you probably have hopefully less of a problem.
It's a big, nice reminder because things do happen. Harassment does happen here. It's happened to my friends, and unfortunately, it's something that needs to be addressed. And I'm glad that they're taking steps to put it more in the forefront that people can see it, like a large poster.
Here's a list of do's that are acceptable, and here's a list of don'ts, because you can't assume everyone, especially there's 150,000 people here this weekend. And everyone's got the same boundaries or the same whole training. So we have to kind of come to some sort of mutual agreement in these spaces. Whether it is don't touch the cosplayers without asking, or have give people 3 feet, a little bit of a bubble of space wherever you can, so that people know what is acceptable and they cannot say they don't know.
Well, one of the things that we wanted to make very clear is that harassment can be subjective.
In my day job, I'm a youth services librarian, and I see a lot of young people, teenagers, who are maybe not as aware of these harassment issues at cons.
But also, I've noticed that it's also very often very true that people will say when they are said and they're told that they've done something wrong, why didn't we any harm? And you probably didn't. It doesn't mean you didn't do any harm. Intention and impact are two different things. But people sometimes need to actually be told, do not do this thing.
So one of the things I like about the policy is that it accounts for harassment as disruption, not just for its effects and not just the intention behind it.
So I actually was very adamant that I thought there should be something in there about no free hugs signs. I think that's a pretty common form of putting your body just way too close to somebody else's when they don't want it, and it often seems like teen girls especially kind of get roped into that and maybe are made to feel uncomfortable. And me and Rachel Adaden, who was also on it, were both like, absolutely not, none of that.
It also discusses unsolicited photography, and not just in context of cosplayers, but in context of, for example, there are panels where people will sometimes ask not to be photographed or ask that people not take photographs during the panel. And just basically, it articulates a lot of boundaries that I think most people assume in most contexts are common sense, but kind of get thrown out the window at conventions because the line between people who are there to enjoy it, people who are there as professionals, and people who are there, in essence, as displays, is really fuzzy and really flexible, and again, very, very individual. I think it was really important that the policy addressed that directly.
It's really exciting to see, especially at New York Comic Con this year, just that the harassment policy is being taken seriously. We've heard stories already about people who were harassing other people and have been removed from the con. So it's really cool to see that actually happening. Obviously, it would be cool if that person never harassed anyone. But the fact that the zero tolerance aspect of what's going on is actually legitimately zero tolerance is really cool.
Or having a policy and then not enforcing it in some ways can be more demeaning to the person that brings up the charge of harassment or has something happen to them because they feel that there should be a system in place and that it's failed.
It makes people feel like you know that there's a problem and you're refusing to act on it. So the fact that they are actually enforcing it is really cool. It's great that they have it, and then it's even better that they're doing something about it.
Coming forward about harassment is incredibly difficult because in a context where harassment is tolerated, reporting it is what's seen as a violation of boundaries or rocking the boat. And especially in an industry as small and insular as comics, there's a very, very strong tendency to sort of close ranks around abusers or around people who are on the receiving end of complaints.
So one of the things that comes up a lot when we're talking about harassment and fandom is the idea that just because someone said something at one time, it's not harassment. And in theory, this is true. In theory, that the person who says something nasty to you and keeps on walking probably isn't harassing you. However, fandom being fandom, the people you see in one con are often the people you see in multiple cons. They're often the people you see in multiple events. And so you may have that same kind of encounter with that one person or that one person's friends 4, 5, 6, 7 times in the same con or across several cons across the year. And often it's a phenomenon known as the missing stare.
The term missing stares generally refers to harassers, abusers, people who are causing active or passive harm in a community and are tolerated and not really publicized, and it's assumed that the appropriate thing to do is to step over or step around, because everyone knows that stair is missing. If you put your foot through the staircase, it's your own damn fault, and the attitude that informs that.
The person who is a harasser at this con is a harasser at that con, is a harasser at their job or in their home life, a lot of places.
In conventions, that term might refer to, for example, people who are generally, understood to engage in serial harassment, or the people who, you might avoid at parties where there's a lot of drinking.
Or, just making the sort of comments that women are used to, unfortunately.
We wave it off, so-and-so is a jerk, so-and-so is an asshole, whatever. And then the story breaks, right? Because you hear about it happening. I'm co-chairing WizCon this year. You hear about it happening someplace like WizCon or ReaderCon or these other cons, and what happens is that someone will say, I never knew about so-and-so, and then right after the I never knew comes 15 people who tell a story from someplace else. And sometimes those stories are worse than the story that you have in your con or in your space. Sometimes it's exactly the same story. And then you realize that this pattern has been going on for 15 years. So maybe it's not so much bullying, maybe it's not so much that they're threatening people, maybe it is that they're inviting someone up to their room to talk about books, and then in fact they try to sexually assault them. Maybe it's that they find a way to touch people without permission. Maybe it's that they tend to crowd a specific person or a member of a specific group every single time they go to a fan event. Or maybe it's that they turn up in blog comments and they're really, really nice to the people who look like them, or the people like them, or to you, whoever you might be, but then they're harassing someone and you don't know.
There was a series of incidents in very quick succession in a conversation after the conversation started and was sort of ramping up slowly that I think accelerated it more than it might otherwise have. I think another really big factor is social media and the ability of professionals and fans to form closed communities and talk and compare notes, even if they don't know each other personally, even if they might not be comfortable emailing each other. That kind of gave a bunch of us a sense of just how pervasive it is and the extent to which concerns about it and concerns about reporting it and consequences of that have maybe affected people's career trajectories or have been informed by the idea that the things we've experienced in isolation. And being able to speak, maybe not for a community, but at least as a larger block and having the power of that collective voice is, I think, really critical.
It used to be that you couldn't get a reporter or anyone to write about it. Well, now you don't need a reporter. You can hop online and you can put a blog post or you can link to it on Twitter. And that sucker will go viral a couple hours later and people will be discussing it. And sure, some people will say some really, really stupid things, but you can't help them. And other people will go, oh, and then they'll tell their story.
People have been speaking out more when it happens to them, and I think that's the way that change happens. You have to be brave enough to speak up, and when somebody speaks up, other people who have been harassed by the same people or who have had their own experience, it gives them the courage to speak up as well. And that's how change happens.
And it winds up now, I think, where people are starting to realize just how widespread it is. Because I think to some degree we've all sort of comfortably assumed, right, fandom tends to be, well, we're a community, we're a family, we're all together, we're all the same, we all love this show, this book, whatever. And then they're starting to realize, hey, this person who was a problem in this fandom that left that fandom 4 years ago is a problem over here, a problem over there. Maybe things are worse than we realize because now we can see it. Now we can hear directly from the person who's been affected, or multiple people who've been affected, out of their own mouths. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. And it's a lot more difficult to say that, oh, it's personal drama, even though somebody will still find a way to that. When you can see an account of someone maybe being grabbed or shoved,
The other thing that's really beneficial is it's 2014 and we all carry recording devices around in our pockets. And that's another really good way of making sure this becomes something that actually has to be addressed, especially if it's something of a legal nature. So that is, again, no longer he said, she said, what they said on the police report, and up to a matter of opinion. It's really obvious that these things came out of that person's mouth.
So I think it's a really great thing that they're putting up these posters and that they're really backing the fact that cosplay is not consent. And I've actually noticed a difference in people asking and are more polite about taking pictures, and they haven't like grabbed at me or anything that like has happened to me in the past. So I do think this is a positive change, and I hope it continues.
Yeah, and I feel like I've noticed a lot more female cosplayers this year than I have at other conventions. I mean, I haven't been to New York Comic Con before, but I've seen a lot more women doing a lot more different costumes this year than I've seen in the past. And it just seems like people have been more respectful, which I appreciate. And like the only guy who weirdly hit on me asked if he could hold my hand, and I was like, well, that is way less weird and sexual than that could have been.
Yeah. So it's been good.
The community is changing a lot. There's a lot of diversity being added to the community, which is wonderful. It was already diverse. I think people just didn't realize it until now. But it's changing and growing constantly, and I think a lot of times people either don't want to accept that or don't understand how to deal with the change, and then that's where harassment occurs.
I think it's less a question of the idea that there are more women reading comics now than that there are more women visibly reading comics. Comics has always had a really large female readership.
The readership was there, in maybe not to the extent that it is now, but I think it was larger than people wanted to believe. And I think that advents of things like the Avengers movie and stuff like that kind of made it more okay to be a nerd in general, and that meant that everybody came out. I mean, there's been a big push in just comic book readers in general.
Comics have become more mainstream as of late, so a lot of the movies and like the TV shows are more broad once you watch them, and they don't really follow the comics as much, and it's, you know, it's trying to appeal to the general audience more, which is probably why it's bringing in more of the female audience.
What I think's changed most significantly is the visibility, the degree of organization, and the degree of influence and an impact on the larger fan community.
Comic books have been marketed to men, and what sells comic books happens to be scantily clad women in improbable-looking armor. That's just the way it's been. It's nice that we're now moving a little bit away from that, and we're getting more of a diversity of character. But yes, that's the way it was, and that's the way it is, and we just need to see that this was the past, and now we are moving a little bit further into the future, and things change, and that's nice.
I would say that as a whole, this sort of nerd culture, or just all culture really, is sort of changing in a way that more women and more people who are not maybe necessarily considered the target audience of these properties and these sort of, you know, fandoms are speaking up and saying, you know, we've been here, we've been fans for a really long time, and the fact that you don't recognize us as fans because we're different is not cool. And so more people have been speaking up about it, and I think the culture has been changing to reflect that in a really positive and great way.
Women's issues in elections and in popular culture have become more important and more looked at, and women have become more of a market for different products. It's for movies and entertainment, as well as for comic books and books in general.
I think that it was addressed well by some parts of the industry. Image Comics and Marvel both do an excellent job, or they're making steps in that direction.
The day it was released, my friend sent me the painting that they did when they released the character, and she was like, you should cosplay this. So I looked at it and I was like, oh, that's amazing. Finally, something that doesn't have spandex and lots of rich detail, and it would be fun.
And then there's still a number of problematic things. I mean, Grimm's Fairy Tales still comes out every month, and DC has had a couple of slip-ups. Although with Batgirl and Gotham Academy, they're making headway as well.
That's what women want. They want to see themselves represented in media, you know, and just real complex characters. And I think that would be very appealing, not only to women, I think it would be appealing in general.
I think the thing that moving forward I would want to see is more female creators on books. It's one thing to have a really great female character, but if it's still being written and drawn by a couple of white dudes, you know, there's more that can be done to diversify in general with creators.
I want to see more diversity in positions with hiring power. Something that I've seen at a lot of publishers is a very high concentration of women, of younger women in lower and entry level positions. Which, yeah, people need to move up through the ranks, that happens. But comics as an industry has very, very high turnover. And the thing that makes the difference statistically and across industries and across businesses to general diversity is diversity in positions with hiring power. So what I'd like to see is more female senior editors, more queer senior editors, more senior editors of color, and more people who are more, VPs, more people who have the power to determine publishing lines. I'd also like to see more active recruitment in those fields. There's a sense and there's a fallacy that the reason that there aren't, more women drawing superhero comics is that they're just not interested. And the actual truth is one of the reasons maybe a lot of women aren't, but also you're talking about a community and an industry that spent years actively and aggressively alienating women, and especially female professionals. And saying, the door's open, if you're not coming in, you don't want to be there, doesn't really fix that. You need to actively go out and counter, that reputation that took time to build.
Yeah, like I said, the culture is changing, and I think it's changing in a way that's more inclusive. And as much as people who secretly don't want it to be inclusive hate that, it's happening. So whether they like it or not, we're here.
Ask questions. If you think something is problematic but you're not sure, I think there's a lot of fear about asking, like, is this thing I like a problem? Or, calling out people who you might find behave problematically. It takes a lot of voices to make change. So individually, if you're asking questions, if you're educating yourself, if you're able to speak to issues when they arise within your community of geekiness, then you're in a position to make change on a bigger level.
Believe the victim, right? Even if you don't know, start out with believing the victim. It can be disproved later, but start from that place that someone's coming forward and saying this thing because something bad has happened. And I'm not going to deny that there is a very small percentage, despite the hype, it's actually less than 1% of false allegations. But start from that place, lean towards listening to the victim.
But I feel people should have self-control in general. That's how I see it. No matter what, if it's a man or a woman, no matter what they're wearing, I feel just people need to have respect and self-control and understand that everyone's here to have fun. And, just don't be a buzzkill and just have a good time. And
I think having zero tolerance for things that you see is really important and is a big factor in changing how this works. For example, I saw a photographer doing something she should not have done, and I didn't say anything on Thursday. And I'm not afraid to admit that because I want you guys to know that that was a bad thing on my part, and that we all need to learn from that. Because if I would have said something to the photographer, then he would have understood what he was doing is wrong and not have done it again. At least in my field of view. But if that would have saved one person that harassment, then that's one better thing in the community. So I think it's important to have zero tolerance for any of this behavior that we're talking about. And absolutely speak up if you can, if you feel comfortable speaking up, or go to someone who you feel comfortable with to report it.
Be a decent person. That sounds silly, but be the person who you would have liked to have had to introduce you to the comics community and who you'd like to encounter at shows. If you are here because you love comics, because you love the characters you love, because you love the artists and writers you love, be a good ambassador for those things. Be representative of what you found in those things and what you got out of those things. And recognize that it's okay for people to love things and care about things in ways that may not be the same as you do, to like different things, to be more or less immersed in different aspects of things, and encourage that. At the same time, also call out bad behavior. Address it personally. If you're with a friend and they're being kind of a jerk and they're taking pictures of cosplayers without asking, tell them that's not cool. The sense that being a tolerant and accepting and welcoming community means tolerating bad behavior is, I think, a really damaging fallacy. In the same way that you can still have an open sandbox and deter people from throwing sand or peeing in it.